In this episode, this is actually a talk that I just presented at a Secrets in Healthcare conference this last weekend. So, the podcast that I do right now and my next podcast are going to be from presentations that I gave at that Secrets in Healthcare conference. Before I get started, just remember that the three columns of disease, when you have these three things, you are starting to cause damage to every single organ in your body. And that's when you have high inflammation, high insulin levels, and high blood glucose levels. When you have those three things, you're getting ready to damage all the blood, all the organs in your body. Now, just to be clear, when you have high insulin levels and inflammation, those two things come 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before you ever see a high blood glucose. So that's what we're going to be talking about is what's going on for that 10, 20, 30, 40 years when your insulin levels are high, your inflammation is high, but your glucose is still normal, because that's what's causing a lot of this medication misdirection that we see. So first, what causes these three columns, the high insulin, the inflammation, and the high glucose? It's man-made food. All the stuff that you get at a grocery store on these center aisles in a box, bottle, bag, and can with a list of ingredients of all the chemicals they put in that food, that's what is killing us. If you could just stay away from that, you will be amazed at how much better you feel. And this is what the problem is, because this is the first diabetic medication misdirection that we get. Because the way the drug companies have taught all of us in the medical field, they've taught the physicians, they've taught the nurses, they've taught the dietitians, they've taught the pharmacists. They teach us that what we need, that diabetes is a problem of having too high blood glucose. And that is not true. They're trying to take your eye off the ball. So what this really is, high blood glucose is just a symptom of diabetes. What actually type 2 diabetes is, it's insulin resistance. And that's what I'll explain how we become insulin resistant. So remember, as I've been saying all along, when you keep your insulin levels high, you force your body to store fat. When you keep your insulin levels low, you force your body to burn the fat out of your fat cells. So obviously, the key to losing fat, becoming healthy, keeping your insulin levels low, keeping inflammation out, is to keep your insulin levels low. And the key to that is quit putting glucose in your mouth. That's what happens. Because what you find out is there are only two ways that you get a high blood glucose. There's only two ways. You either take the glucose out of your glucose storage that you have on your body, or you eat it. Now, as far as taking it out of your stores, you do not have very many glucose stores. 10% of your liver is all the glucose stores you have. That's a glucose storage. The storage form of glucose is called glycogen. That's like a little glucose brick. Your liver, about 10% of your liver are glycogen stores. Then every single skeletal muscle that you have, each muscle, also 1% of each muscle is also glycogen storage, but that is only good for that one muscle cell. So it doesn't work for all the energy needs of your body. So that means all the rest of your body, all you have is 10% of your liver. That's only about 400 calories. And even if you take in all the glycogen stores in your skeletal system, also add that to the liver store, so you totally drain your body of glucose, it only comes about 2,400 calories. That's about how much you're going to use when you sleep for 24 hours. So it's not very much energy. Obviously not the energy that we were supposed to be able to go for if we had to go days without eating like we used to back centuries ago. So that alone should let you know we are not supposed to be using glucose for our energy stores. That glucose is supposed to be used for our fight or flight energy. That's how that works. All our other energy is supposed to be coming from our fat cells. But since we've started eating all this man-made food, since our fake dietary guidelines came out back in the 1977, okay, those were fake guidelines. Those were not real. There was no scientific backing behind the food pyramid, behind the thought of eating fat makes you fat. None of that had scientific backing. It was all just marketing to be able to sell more food. And just so happens by selling more of this man-made frankenfood, we also get to buy more medications. So now everybody, all the corporations are winning, and the only one losing is you. So that's why I want to make sure you understand. So The only way you get the glucose into your blood from your storage is when you're in a fight or flight, a stress situation, and the cortisol makes that glycogen break down and put that in your system. The only other way you get a high blood glucose is because you eat it. That's it. So obviously, like I said, if you have a trouble with high blood glucose, quit putting it in your mouth and you will be perfectly fine. How much glucose do we need? How much are we supposed to have? Zero. The minimum daily requirement for glucose is zero. You never ever have to put glucose in your mouth and you'll be perfectly fine. Where does glucose come from? Glucose is the basic building block of all plant-based foods. So animal-based foods are made up mainly of protein and of fat. The food that the plant food is made up of protein and carbohydrates. A carbohydrate is the basic building block of glucose. Nowhere in nature are you going to see fat and carbohydrates in the same thing. You only see that in man-made food because fat and carbohydrates together are the very worst combination you could have. A burger with a bun or pizza or donuts or any of this other crud that we are being sold. When you eat that stuff, the carbohydrate portion causes your blood glucose to go high. Once your blood glucose is high, you're forcing your body to store fat. The fat that it's storing, one will be the other fat that you mixed in the food that you just ate. That's one place. Or it can also, all the excess glucose that you take in automatically gets turned into fat in the form of triglycerides. And so it stores that. So anytime you eat a meal that has both a carbohydrate and fat in it, you are doing yourself a disfavor. So stay away from the carbohydrate, keep your insulin levels low, and then you can have that meat and fat all you want. And that's exactly what you should be eating. That is what is healthy. If you take all the blood out of your body, you take all the glucose out of your blood, it only comes to 2 teaspoons full of sugar. That's all the glucose we have. If you're talking about a fasting glucose between 80 and 100, that's going to equilibrate to about 2 teaspoons full of sugar. Back in 1965, that's what it looked like. That's what is estimated that we took in was 2 teaspoons full of sugar per person per day. However, now in 2015, since they've been feeding us all this Franken food from these food manufacturers, now it's estimated that our average intake has gone from 2 teaspoons per person per day of sugar up to 65 teaspoons of sugar per person per day. Remember, all our body, all our bloodstream has a 2 teaspoons full. So every single piece of glucose that you're putting in your mouth is getting turned straight into triglycerides and stored as fat. That's what's going on. So we were never supposed to be using sugar for our main energy source, but that's what they've done. So now that we're eating all this glucose all the time, once our glucose levels start dropping, we get hungry. So we reach more for the same crud that's been killing us, and it's more glucose. So we keep living off glucose for our energy source, which is doing all kinds of damage through our body. And we're forcing our body to stuff fat into our fat cells the entire time. So that's what you do not want to do. So what does our body do? And remember, you may think, oh, there's no way I eat 65 teaspoons of sugar per person per day. I don't eat that. But if you think that one 12-ounce bottle of soda pop has 10 teaspoons of sugar, and all the soda pop, fruit juice, energy drinks, cakes, cookies, bread, pasta, all of that is made out of glucose. It's all made out of glucose. So what does our body do with all this massive amount of glucose that we're taking in? There's only four things our body does. As soon as we eat a meal, a carbohydrate that has glucose, which all carbohydrates do, all plant-based foods do, when you put that into your bloodstream, your glucose levels go up. When your glucose levels go up, that forces your insulin levels to go up. Now, once insulin is there, what it does, the first thing it's going to do is going to take whatever glucose you need for the energy you're going to be doing right then. So like a half hour to an hour after you eat, which most people just sit down or lay down after that. But if you go up and you get out and you go for a walk, or if you lift or you do some kind of activity, you'll burn a little bit of glucose, but you're not going to be burning very much. Just to put it in perspective, if you lift very heavy weights for an hour, you do a full blown hour of heavy lifting, you may burn around 400 to 800 calories. That's all you're going to burn. And you're taking in a lot more of that with each one of these meals. So the amount that you do walking or something, it's still good to walk. You should always, walking after a meal is always a great thing to do. It's really not going to burn that much of the glucose out of your system. The next thing that insulin does is it goes and it fills up. Remember, we were talking about the glycogen stores, 10% of your liver and 1% of each skeletal muscle. If any of those glycogen stores are depleted, then insulin will put sugar in those areas also, put the glucose in those areas. But again, most of us have so much glucose on board, our glucose stores don't get emptied very much at all. Then the third thing, if your blood concentration of glucose goes over 150 to 180 milligrams per deciliter, which is a lot, remember fasting glucose, you want between 80 and 100. If it goes over 150 to 180, it automatically spills over into the urine. That's how God made our bodies. Our bodies are made not to let your glucose levels go too high and then it'll spill in. So all that really doesn't take much of the glucose at all from a meal. So the majority of all the food that you eat that have carbohydrates that have glucose in it, the majority of that is going to go straight to the liver, and insulin is going to tell the liver to turn that into triglycerides. And then what happens after that, that kind of depends on genetics. But what happens with your liver, what the liver does is they make what's called, I call these fat mobiles. VLDL is a fat mobile. It's like when you go to your doctor and get your cholesterol panel, they look at the VLDLs, the LDLs, the HDLs, triglycerides, and total cholesterol. A fat mobile, a VLDL, all that is not cholesterol. It is a carrier protein. It's called a lipoprotein. And this carrier protein is made in the liver. And what it does is it's a protein shell and it stores cholesterol, which is made in the liver. 80% of all the cholesterol your body has is made in the liver, because cholesterol is extremely vital to health. And it's a lie that cholesterol is what's killing everybody. But what your body does in the liver, it makes this VLDL. It's called a very low density lipoprotein. And picture it like a ship or like a semi truck. And this puts all the cholesterol and triglycerides that are made in the liver, it puts them all into this little carrier, this fat mobile, VLDL fat mobile. It puts it out in the blood, and then it circulates all around your blood, depositing the cholesterol and the fat, the triglycerides, all the places that it needs in the body, which is a lot of places, because cholesterol and fat are extremely vital to our life. We have to have these. So it goes around, does it. As this large VLDL, as it's this fat mobile, as it starts giving up its triglycerides and cholesterol, it shrinks. So it shrinks from a VLDL down to an IDL, which is intermediate density lipoprotein, and then it shrinks down more to an LDL. That's a low density lipoprotein. This is perfectly normal. LDLs are perfectly normal. Having high LDL levels means nothing whatsoever. We have been hoodwinked by the drug companies to think high LDLs are a problem. And I'll explain to you what the problem really is. We have this fat mobile. It's turned back into an LDL, and then it gives just a little bit more triglycerides and cholesterol away. Then it goes back to the liver. It attaches to the liver. The liver takes that in, puts more cholesterol and more triglyceride into this fat mobile, and it puffs it back up to a VLDL again, and then sends that back out into your bloodstream again to go through the same cycle. That is all perfectly normal. That's the way our bodies are made. Okay. The problem is, once this fat mobile gets to the cell, this is where genetics comes in. Because once it gets to this fat cell, it goes to the fat cell and says, hey, I have some triglycerides for you where you want to take them in. So the fat cell's, yes, go ahead and give that to me because your insulin levels are high. So the fat cell takes in these triglycerides. Then pretty soon another fat mobile comes through with more triglycerides. So it says, okay, so it puts that in the fat cell too. And as these fat mobiles keep going by, the fat cell keeps getting bigger and bigger until all of a sudden it is totally stuffed. So now this fat mobile is coming through with its cholesterol and triglycerides, this VLDL, or now it may be an LDL or an IDL. When it comes through, it goes to the fat cell and says, I've got some more triglycerides for you. And the cell is like, I can't hold any more. I'm perfectly stuffed. Take that on down to the next cell. And that's what happens. Insulin resistance is from having a fat cell that is so stuffed, it cannot take any more triglycerides. That cell is now considered insulin resistant. And since we have fat cells all over our body, that's why it takes 10, 20, 30, 40 years to have full-blown insulin resistance, because you're spending all that time taking all this glucose that you're eating, turning triglycerides and stuffing that into all your fat cells. That's why it takes so long. Now, here's where there's a difference, because as far as genetics, there are some people Most of us have a fixed number of fat cells. After around 18, after around puberty, we don't get any more fat cells. We have all the fat cells we're going to use. So once all our fat cells are stuffed, now we have insulin resistance, total insulin resistance, and now we actually have type 2 diabetes where our glucose rises. The difference is there are some people who are very thin, but they still have type 2 diabetes. That's because they have the fixed number of fat cells also, but it's not very many fat cells. So as soon as their fat cells get full, now they start stuffing all this fat around their organs. So these are people are called TOFI, TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And that's why they had few fat cells to begin with, but now those are all stuffed. Then on the other extreme are the people who are very obese, but they still don't have type 2 diabetes. That's because they have a genetic disposition of their fat cells never do get full, because as their fat cells start to fill, they can actually make more fat cells. So when you can keep making more fat cells, that's called adipocyte, which means fat cell, adipocyte hyperplasia. You just keep making more cells. So since none of their cells get totally stuffed, they never end up with diabetes. Versus your TOFI, those are the ones that they do get stuffed, but they didn't have very many. But most of us, and even though the obese people, even though they don't get diabetes, they still have all the other issues that you run into when you have obesity. You have a lot of fat on board when you're so obese, because all these fat cells are endocrine organs. They're making all kinds of hormones. Like they have aromatase, they turn testosterone into estrogen. So the more fat cells you have, the less testosterone you have, more estrogen you have. But for the most of us, we have a fixed number of cells, but it's quite a few cells. So that's why it takes 10, 20, 30 years to get all those cells totally full. Once they're full, we start storing our blood glucose levels start rising, and we're storing all this fat around our organs. And that's where all the organ damage starts occurring. Insulin resistance is when your fat cell is too full. So there's nothing wrong with the insulin. It's still turning all that glucose into triglycerides. There's nothing wrong with the cell. It's doing what it can. It's just too stuffed. And there's nothing wrong with your pancreas. It's still able to produce the insulin. How do diabetic drugs work? All diabetic drugs work one of two ways, except for one class. But they all work by either causing the pancreas to produce more insulin, or they make your cells more sensitive to insulin. So all diabetic drugs are doing is causing you to stuff even more triglycerides in your fat cells than they want to hold. Eventually, everybody on diabetic medications is going to get worse. It's not taking care of the problem. Remember, the problem is having too high insulin levels for too long. Has nothing, that's high glucose is just a side effect of that. Okay. So the interesting thing with this, when you look at the medications, is back in the 1900s, there were only two classes of diabetic drugs. There were sulfonylureas, and then there were the biguanides. So sulfonylureas, those are the ones, glyburide or glipizide. Those work by making your pancreas produce more insulin. Then the biguanides, there's only one class there's only one drug, and that's metformin. And those make your cells more sensitive to the insulin. But through the whole 1900s, we only had these two classes that incorporate about 7 different medications total between those two classes. And we never came up with another diabetic drug in the 1980s and 1990s because they said there were not enough type 2 diabetic patients to make it worth their while to make anymore. And in all the studies that were shown, just by decreasing the blood glucose, and that's all, it didn't have any effect on improving health whatsoever. So that's all we had coming into the 2000s. But another thing that was happening around that time was this is when we came up with the A1C. And I won't explain the A1C right here, but I did a whole podcast on it, podcast number 70, about what is an A1C laboratory test. And that'll explain it. But once we found out about the A1C, which is a way that you can measure what the average glucose has been for the last 3 to 4 months, the reason it's for the last 3 to 4 months is because that is the lifespan of a red blood cell. And A1C is really a hemoglobin A1C. There's a protein called hemoglobin on your red blood cell, and that's what glucose attaches to, because glucose, anytime you have a high blood glucose, it attaches to all the proteins in your body, and your body is made out of proteins. Everything you touch, your muscles, your bones, your skin, your hair, your organs, everything is made out of protein. And when you have high blood glucose attaches to proteins and it makes it where it's damaged. It's called glycation. The red blood cells the same way. The hemoglobin is a protein, and you have the glucose attaches to that. So you have a red blood cell floating around for 3 to 4 months during its lifespan. The higher your blood glucose is, the more glucose gets on this red blood cell. And so we can measure that. So the A1C, when we spill our glucose into the urine, that has an A1C of about 8. And that's the only way we used to be able to test diabetes, is to test the urine. Then we found out we could test the blood. We learned how to do that, but that only gave us a snapshot. What was your blood glucose at that time? And which a lot of people, they realized, they got smart and said, oh, if I just quit eating carbohydrates for 3 to 4 days before I go in, my blood glucose is going to look fine. And that's what people were doing. But now we have the A1C, so they can't fake it out like that, because this keeps your average glucose for the last 3 to 4 months. Okay. So when the A1C first came out, we were saying anything, an A1C above 8 was bad and below 8 was good, because that's when our body naturally spilled the glucose into the urine. But now that we have the A1C, we said, wait a minute, why don't we say, instead of above 8 being bad, let's say above 7 is bad. And once they dropped that down to 7, they were able to put more people on diabetic medications. Because now if you go in for the 7.5 A1C, at one time that was going to be good. And now they say they need to put you on diabetic medications, which, as I just showed you, makes you stuff more fat in your fat cells and makes diabetes worse. And then they said, let's drop that down to 7. Maybe not 7. Why don't we go down to 6.4? Let's say anything above 6.4 is bad. Anything less than 6.4 is good. So that's more medication that we were able to start putting people on. And then we had a group of people that came together with much funding from the drug companies to the American Diabetic Association when they came up with this term, pre-diabetes. And they said pre-diabetes, let's say that's from 5.7 to 6.4. The only reason they did that is so they can give more diabetic medications, because there's nothing about that. Pre-diabetes is what's going on for that 10, 20, 30, 40 years prior to having full-blown diabetes. What pre-diabetes is when you have high insulin levels, but your glucose levels are normal. Pre-diabetes is high insulin and normal glucose, and this happens for decades. It is not an A1C of 5.7 to 6.4. That's a way to put more people on diabetic medications. Now, did this work? This worked wonders, because before, remember back in the 1900s, I said there were only 2 classes of drugs, and that incorporated 7 meds. No more diabetic medications through the 80s and 90s. Since this time, we are averaging about 1 diabetic drug every single year, because now instead of having 2 classes and 7 drugs, they've added an additional 4 classes and an additional 25 medications. So just since they said there weren't enough diabetics, there wasn't any reason to make any more diabetic drugs, now we have a total of 6 classes and 31 medications. Like I said, a new diabetic drug every year, and the number keeps going up, and our diabetic patients are getting sicker and sicker. Go to your doctor and ask if this diabetic medication is going to make you better, get rid of your diabetes. It is not. They may not even know. I didn't know. I didn't know about all this until about 5 years ago. I was brainwashed like everybody else was, thinking that all we had to do is get this blood glucose down, and didn't realize that we were making everything worse. So that's the other medication misdirection. Is the first one, remember, was they have you look at blood glucose instead of your blood insulin. The second one is they have you look at your A1C, which means how high your blood glucose is, and they have you look at weight loss. What you should be looking at is what is your insulin level, and you want to look at fat loss, because these medications like these GLP-1 agonists and all these other things that they're giving to these people that are making them sicker and sicker, one, they all have massive amount of adverse effects, anywhere from 30 to 70 per drug, 30 to 70 different adverse effects. And adverse effects means a harmful thing that it does to your body. An adverse effects means we made a drug to fix this one little thing, like bringing your glucose down, but it harms all these other things in your body. 30 to 70 per medication that's out there is what we have now. If you have, let's just take the GLP-1 agonist. So everybody's talking about these. That does a couple different things. One, yes, it does paralyze the stomach. It makes it to where food stays in there, and it makes it where you're not very hungry. so you don't eat. The other thing it does, and they aren't promoting this, but it does, it stimulates your pancreas to produce more insulin. That's the way our body works. Okay. So you have this GLP-1, it's making you where you're not hungry, so you don't eat. When you do not eat, there are certain things your body has to have to live. Our bodies, if you tear our bodies up and see what we're made out of, we're made out of protein, we're made out of fat, we're made out of cholesterol, we're made out of vitamins, we're made out of minerals and water. Those 6 things are what we're made out of. We are not made out of glucose. We have tiny glucose stores. But since our dietary guidelines came out saying that's the major nutrient we should be eating is all carbohydrates, you never ever have to eat a carbohydrate and be perfectly fine. I am not talking about God-made carbs, real fruit, real vegetables. However, you do have to be careful with those. They are plants. They do have toxins in them because they don't want animals eating them until they're ready, and maybe not at all. Okay. And the plants that grow below the ground have a lot more glucose because the starch is just long chains of glucose. So if you do have glucose issues, you might want to avoid the plants that grow below the ground and maybe just stick to the ones that grow above the top. And fruit, really want to minimize your fruit, especially if there's a high fructose content, because fructose also gets turned immediately into triglycerides and stored as fat. So, what happens with these drugs? If you don't eat, your body needs energy. So, if you're not eating it, it's going to take it from your fat cells, which is the way God made us. We're supposed to get our energy from our fat cells, and that's great. So, you see your fat cells shrink, you see your body getting smaller, things like that happening. These drugs are working is because you're not hungry, you're not eating protein either. So now you're eating your muscles, your own muscles, for its protein content. When you look at these people on these GLP-1 agonists, yeah, they're losing weight, okay, because they're losing fat, but the majority of the weight they're losing is muscle, and you do not want to be losing your muscle mass. The other thing, they have you look at the A1C, your glucose is down because the pancreas, the drug is causing the pancreas to produce more insulin, and you're not eating very much. So if you're only looking at the glucose, you look like you're doing great. Look, my A1C is down and I'm losing weight. But they don't say, oh yeah, your A1C is down, but now your insulin's even higher than it was. And yeah, you're losing weight, but most of it is muscle. You want to look at your insulin levels and you want to look at your fat loss. The key is to maintain your vitamins, your minerals, and your protein for your muscles while using your fat for your energy source. The way you do that is you eat animal-based products. That's meat and that's fat, that's cholesterol, that's everything you need. It has all the vitamins, all the minerals you need. That's what your main meal should be, is animal-based products. And that's where you get your protein, because now you get protein that helps with your muscles. You get the vitamins, your minerals. You do get fat, but fat doesn't raise your insulin levels, and protein does just very little. So when you eat that kind of meal, you keep your insulin levels low. So you still are eating their fat out of your fat cells for your energy source, but you're giving yourself your protein source and everything else. That's the key. The other thing that I want you to realize is, because you're supposed to look at the insulin levels and fat loss, not sugar levels and weight loss, but you can get your own insulin. If you go to the doctor and ask him for a fasting insulin, you may freak him out, because the drug companies never teach the physicians about getting insulin levels. Some of them do, but most of them don't. They won't even know why you're asking for an insulin level. The other thing that's crazy is because the same people who put on all the studies that go around and educate our physicians and nurses and pharmacists and everybody else, the drug companies with their studies that they pay for, they go around and they tell everybody that if you do get a fasting insulin, you want that insulin level less than 20. That's what happens when you're using glucose for your main energy source. What you really want is to have your insulin levels less than 5. And really, if you could have it less than 3, that'd be great. But as long as it's less than 5, that means your insulin is doing fine. That means that you're not stuffing fat in your fat cells. You're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're using your fat for your energy source, and you're still being able to give your muscles and everything the protein and vitamins and minerals that everything needs. Now, you can do this on your own. My wife went and she did this. She got on our computer here at the house, and she went onto a website called Own Your Labs, OWNYOURLABS.com, ownyourlabs.com. She went in, she ordered, said that she wanted an insulin level. They gave her a piece of paper and she took it to a place here in town called LabCorp, LABCORP. She took it to LabCorp. She gave them the paperwork. They drew her blood. It only cost $15. And within the week, she had the results back. And her results came back. Her level was 3. We didn't need a physician because, again, some physicians may know about insulin levels and most probably don't, because just like pharmacists, just like physicians, nurses, dietitians, most of us are going by the studies and everything that the drug companies put out, not realizing that those studies all come out in favor of the drugs. Almost every single drug study that any drug company does comes out in favor of taking their medication. And that is what I'm trying to explain to people, not to do that. I wanted you to understand. Now, I hope you know pre-diabetes is high insulin levels with normal glucose levels. That's pre-diabetes. It happens 10, 20, 30, 40 years before you fill up all your fat cells, depending on how many fat cells you have. But it is not looking at a high blood glucose, and it is not looking at full weight loss. That's where you've been brainwashed or hoodwinked. And so I just want to make sure that you realize that. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, stay nourished and stay well.